Hi, I'm Future Alicia. Welcome to episode 2 of Crypto Native. Today I'm talking to Matt Stephenson about science NFTs and how Matt is using NFTs as a mechanism to redesign incentives around the pursuit of scientific knowledge. And we talk about the different problems that kind of currently exist in the world of academia and science and innovation and funding, and what the future might look like in a Web3 world. Thanks for watching. Hi, Matt. How are you going?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. A reason I wanted to get you on the podcast was because I just came across a piece you wrote about the difference between public goods and like the coordination problem. And now that I've been in kind of kernel for a couple of weeks, and you're in kernel as well, and you were in
Hmm.
block two, is that right?
Block three. Block
And
three. Yeah, I'm
Oh, block
fellow.
three.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
cool. And so this idea of public goods is like so fundamental to what we're doing here with Web3 and how it might be different to kind of the world that we live in real life and on the internet. And so I just wonder, can you maybe just like run me through that? Because I I just want to make sure that I understand, because the point that we got to is that actually everything is a coordination problem. Is that right? And just like walk me through that piece.
Yeah. So we're kind of like in the piece we wrote, which thank you for referring to it and thank you for the compliment on it. Um, yeah, the uptake is that we hope everything is a coordination problem.
Uh-huh.
Like, there's really no answer to the question of whether something is a public goods problem or a coordination problem in the real world, right? Like, these are just models we apply to sort of like understand things. And without being too abstract, like the idea is ultimately like a public goods problem, you hope, is an unsolved coordination problem because you can't solve a public goods
Yes.
problem. You can't. Like the game theory of it, understood correctly, in my view. And I mean, like I'm not here to police anybody's language, but the way it's treated in like the behavioral economics literature, the experimental literature, and is um, a public goods problem is a problem where there's no equilibrium at the sort of social optimum is what it's called. So in economics, you'll often model games where there's like two actors or as many actors as you want who are like playing this game, and they're playing their best strategies, and their best strategies are the ones that are best responses to everybody else's strategy. But there's also this kind of like imaginary agent who doesn't play, who sort of hovers over everything, who's called the social planner. Now that's they don't nobody takes that too seriously. I mean, it doesn't mean you can have a social planner who solves the problem. But what the social planner does in economics is they say, how could we make everybody in the system maximally well off, right? And if there's a game where the people who are playing it can't get to the spot where everybody is maximally well off, that's kind of what a public goods problem looks like, right? It's like this tension between, wow, we could all be doing so much better, but if we try to do it, there's like these little, they're called incentives to defect. And that pulls you away. So I think the example we use in the paper, just real down to earth, is like I think if you live with roommates, you know what it's like to have a sink fill up with dishes, and like everybody wishes it was cleaner, and they'd love to go home and like have the dishes clean, but nobody individually wants to clean it, right? And so there's just kind of a public goods aspect to that where like, yeah, the state of the world we'd all like is the dishes are clean. My personal incentive is I don't want to clean it. I want somebody else to do it, right? And then we might hope that's a coordination problem. So, Sunday morning, you're like, okay, it's springtime. Like, we're not going to live like this anymore. Let's all go clean it up. And when we clean it up, we're going to realize how great it is to have a clean kitchen that we'll always do the dishes from there on out, right? And then what happens is, right, like, yeah, maybe that lasts for a couple of weeks. And then it's just kind of like, probably the same. Maybe it works, but maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe you fall back into it, right? And that's what trying to solve a public goods problem, thinking it's a coordination problem, feels like. You think if you can just get to this place where it's clean, you'll stay there, but you can't sometimes. And when you can't, that's a public goods problem, right? So just to sort of like drill down on the specific question of whether they're all coordination problems or not, that the way of translating that into that example is like, can you ever make a situation where everybody cleans their dishes? Maybe. I mean, just you have to keep trying, right? Do we put a list on Do we kick out one of the roommates hoping they're the problem or whatever, right? New attempts to sort of like solve it and transform it into a coordination problem. Did that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay,
that was really okay. I got a lot of stuff from that. I'm getting really excited because
sure.
I feel like I almost feel like, say, we've been like building with two blocks when it comes to public goods and just like building infrastructure in general and how we organize people from like the roommate to, governments and, you know,
Yeah.
massive national and international infrastructure. So we're building, say, we're building with two blocks. But I feel like Web3 and this crypto space gives us like blocks that we didn't haven't played with before. They might not even be square. They're different shapes. They're really expanding our horizons, right? And so,
Yeah.
um, and this idea of like the most maximally well off. What was that term that you used? Is it
Oh boy, which
maximally optimal?
yeah, there's like the um let's see, socially optimal or the social optimum is sometimes what it's called. If you want to be technical,
Mm-hmm.
you can call it the Pareto optimum. That's the sort of
Okay,
upscale
I'm gonna
economist
go
way to
with
say it. Okay.
okay. I'm gonna go with
Go
socially
social
optimal then.
optimum. Yeah, that's what I try to use.
um, I think that's really interesting, which is like bringing everyone up to a certain level. I really feel like that is something that I get from this kind of crypto Web3 space and what is happening with what everyone's building, with blockchains compared to the real world, which there seems to be like a huge gap between what is socially optimal for some people and it really sucks for other people. And so, yeah, that's really interesting. Just that and also the idea that coordination, what am I trying to say? Okay. So I'm excited with how open minded people are in the space.
Yeah.
That the idea that, okay, so we start with trying to get people to clean the dishes and we come up with coordinating this way. And then that works for a week and then it falls away and we
Mhm.
go back to square one. And so let's try this different. It's almost like you're like putting out tiles of a path and you don't know what's going to happen next. But at least now I feel like we have like the infrastructure to think about continually solving these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think Web3 gives you new tools, right? And the tools have to be used creatively. So I think that's what's really promising about it, right? And obviously, there's this nice kind of element that you see I think it's really the culture of Web3, where people are drawn toward these big problems and attempts to solve them.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really making attempts to solve them and like thinking about that is a really valuable thing. And I mean, you just can't know until you try and you get there. And, maybe it's stable, maybe it's not. And I think it's this kind of like brave, creative act if you do it authentically. I mean, you can also like kind of Pied Piper people to something that's not a solution saying it is, right? Like we're gonna go to the moon or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Not saying any of specific coin isn't going to go to the moon, but it might be hard for all of them to, right? And so yeah. But at the same time, this idea that like we now have these new exciting tools, a few new tools we can play with to solve some of the biggest problems we have in the world, and we have this kind of like energy and some of these norms around attempting to solve it. I think it's really exciting.
Yeah. And so, kind of just following that a little bit further, what is something that you feel like in this, in the Web2 world or in real life, and kind of with the legacy infrastructure that we're dealing with, is so painful? And now, with your exposure to Web3, you're just like, oh my goodness, this means that we could do this with that. Is there anything that is like a burning thing for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's definitely science funding and generally sort of like basic research innovation funding from the beginning. So like this happened toward the tail end of my PhD. I got really interested in like the history of basic science and certain types of like early innovation and things like that. And the incentives in this area are just notoriously awful. I think it's called in economics sometimes the Aerovian problem, and the idea is that um, knowledge, especially like codified knowledge, we should say, like when you write it down or you explain it really well or something like that, is the ultimate public good. Because
Hmm.
right when you have like, let me do a really crude sort of example. Most people I know have this, especially in Web3, but in the most people you talk to around the space will have this kind of there's a sharing feel, I guess I would say, right? But most people also have a private notebook of their own stuff that one day they would like to do, that are like their cool ideas that they'd love to one day work on or whatever. And that tension can give you a feel for what the Aerovian problem is, right? There are these norms around sharing, and we all like to share and everything, but there's also this private recognition that, like, well, my little notebook is like the stuff that I don't want to share yet, because maybe one day I'll want to work on it, right? And there's a little bit of a tragedy in that, in the sense that, like, if you know a problem well, it's not like you're gonna solve a problem that like a car dealership has if you have nothing to do with car dealerships, right? But like, if you know a problem well, it's totally plausible you come up with a lot more solutions that are really viable than things than you will ever get the opportunity to work on, right? Meanwhile, there are also people who are interested in working on problems and very motivated and talented, who also just don't have, let's say, they haven't identified one of the right problems and they would love to have it identified. And this is just um, a classic like opportunity for an effective division of labor, right? Like my favorite example of science funding is, so Einstein's theory of relativity. When you develop it, it's like just this Swiss patent clerk um, working on like weird obscure geometries, right? Like, what if you deny the parallel postulate? Well, it turns out you need that stuff to do GPS, which we all love, right? Imagine a Swiss patent clerk trying to pitch you GPS. Like, could he even know that it could do GPS? Would anybody invest in him? Like, in the meantime, you also have somebody who can be a CEO of like a GPS company, who can manage a company and like grow it to scale and train people and like deliver a product on time and all these other things that we value. And those two skills are like wildly divergent, probably, right? And yet
Yeah.
one really depends on the other. Like the person who can start the GPS company would love Einstein to share. Of course, Einstein did share, but but once it's shared, there's really no reason to attribute or share any sort of resources right back to the sharer, and that's
Mhm.
effectively what the Aerovian problem is. And I think it's something that if you can start to solve it or even do work on it, it's a really exciting thing that could maybe change things in an exciting
Yeah.
way.
And before we just like dig into how we could change things,
Yeah.
so just based on that Einstein GPS example, I feel like something that makes this problem difficult is the time, like just the time between those 2 points.
Yeah.
And so I also read your mirror post on the productivity problem with the like industrial revolution. Like the first
Oh,
industrial revolution
thanks.
happened, and then it was like, how many years was it? Decades?
It's
100
about
years?
50. They don't, it's not
50.
cleanly defined periods, but it's about
Yeah,
50
yeah.
before the second
And
period
so then like
starts.
50 years, and then there's this huge uptick in productivity, and this idea that 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 second revolution happened because of all the groundwork that was laid in the first revolution, but it wasn't very clear, and like the destinations or the outcomes of those innovations weren't immediately visible. But
Yeah.
then I always I think of the kids all the time, which is just that I think of the kids now being born who are growing up with this technology that we are trying to wrap our heads around, and say it's only been around for 20 to 30 odd years, or even newer technology, but what does it look like for them to innovate from a space of being completely native to this technology? And then how do you tie that value back that was I guess it is like an attribution problem, right? And
Hmm.
how do we solve that so people can, because I don't know if this all comes back to money and funding and financing, because a lot of people, you need financial means to be able to work on things. And so is there like a way with Web3 to fix this problem where the people working on the foundational layer of, whatever the knowledge is that later can be, wrapped and weaved into solutions or protocols or businesses or whatever it is? How do we give them the space and the financial means to work on these problems?
Yeah.
Is there kind of,
I think you
yeah,
nailed it. Like that's perfectly put. And I think there are tools to work with in Web3 for doing this. And in particular, I mean, I think Um, obviously, Gitcoin is a great example for funding public goods. Like what they've done with quadratic funding is really amazing. Um, and there's other work being done, but specific to like the science funding, I think what probably needs to happen, you pointed to the time, but also part of it is just like what will feel like incongruity. I mean, you don't see theory of relativity and think GPS device, right? Like that takes probably
Yeah.
another special talent. And so the idea that like really the second person, like the person who can manage a GPS company, like that's a lot. You deserve a reward too, right? Like we want to connect both of these. They just have a market power. So the way Planck tries to solve it, which is that's what um, I'm the founder of Planck, and I drew that Einstein example from an essay I wrote in 2018 on NFTs for science. And the approach with Planck specifically is to try and just do it backwards, right? The idea is like you can't know that Einstein's going to be valuable or not for GPS, right?
Hmm.
All you can do is try to create a commitment for such that there's a norm that if you use this stuff, that you reward it in some way, right? Now, NFTs are a really nice tool for that, in that they provide this kind of nice natural bridge. So, I mean, to pick like a random example, we wrote a paper, some colleagues and I at Block Science, on an automated regression market for like a way to enhance price discovery for like semi-fungible assets and maybe non-fungible assets and whatnot. And you don't know, like when you do the sort of like basic research math type of stuff, will that be useful for somebody or will it not? If it is useful for somebody, will they attribute us or not, right? And one simple way you can attribute us is you could just buy our NFT and display it. Um,
Hmm.
and so that gives you this nice kind of backward looking signal where, like, well, now they can at least enhance their credibility in the marketplace somehow by maybe showing that not only did they attribute, but they sort of like valued it or something, right? So the backward looking stuff, I mean, you have to design around it, but I think NFTs give you that, and I think smart contracts give you that too. The second piece of what we do aside from NFTs is we implement a mechanism which is called the split stream, where participating in this like uh, broader reward mechanism is inherently recognizing that you're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that to do anything, you're always standing on the shoulders of giants, right? That quote is a reference to, or it's a reference to a quote from Isaac Newton, where he says, if I've seen further, it's from standing on the shoulders of giants. And of course,
Hmm.
Isaac Newton is like considered one of the all-time giants of science. He looks down and he
Yeah.
sees giants, right? So we can all say, well, there should be further splits down to the thing we relied on. And by, right, like you can have that in a smart contract. When in fact that's what we ran. We ran the alpha test of this a week ago, right? And so what there is there's this kind of like split encoded in a smart contract. So when you buy my NFT, it doesn't just go to this owner. It goes to these subsidiary addresses, which are citations. They were the results that we relied on, right? So what we did was we split to Mirror, because Mirror is a company that built this really cool tech where we could kind of hack together a first alpha version of the split stream. We basically had to like stack two of their splits together. Like, it cost a bunch of money, but
Oh.
that's how it is. Um,
The joys of stacking Legos for the first time.
yeah, exactly. And they were very helpful on that, by the way. Shout out to Patrick Riviera, who was amazing. Um, so we split to them because it's like, well, look, you guys built this tech and like helped us out. Like, I know you're giving it away for free, but like the nature of this project is we split back. And then also split back to somebody who wrote something publicly about harbinger taxes for NFTs. His name's Simon Delarivier. Um, and actually, I think when I first met Simon, I was like, one day I'm gonna split back to that, because I think it's the right approach. Like, I think it was a design element he put forth first. He openly shared it first, and Planck is going to use it. And so that is the rule of science, or that's the rule that's followed in science typically, is you sort of try to attribute to the first open share of an idea. So we try to kind of embody that norm in our alpha test.
I think that's really interesting in terms of like creating a base layer of values that persist to people, I guess, who aren't from, say, a scientific or an academic background, which is this idea of attribution and citations. And you can really see like the visual, right? When you, and like the web that starts to evolve in your mind when you think, okay, so you referenced Mirror and then Simon, and then it kind of, not only does it go backwards in a web, but I feel like it can go forward in a web, which is that when people come across your work and they might be combining you on one side and someone else on the other side. And so it seems to, in my mind, just really broaden the scope for innovation and cross-pollination, because I feel like all of the most memorable science stories that I hear on podcasts or that I read about are when, two colleagues bump into each other in a lunchroom at a university, or like there's one about the guy who designed like the bullet train in Japan, and he was like fly fishing and he saw how a fish was moving through the water, and he thought, oh, maybe, but they're really random kind of occurrences, but there's lots of webs in different directions. And I feel like, I don't know that we're incentivized now to connect and for that intersection for those intersections to meet. I feel like everything is very narrow, almost intentionally. I don't know if who is trying to limit innovation, that they're trying to keep us siloed instead of letting us kind of all meet. And I guess there's also no easy way to do this, right? Like it's, again, like in terms of coordinating, isn't it really difficult to do the work?
I mean, I think your point about interdisciplinarity and like cooperation across disciplines in these silos is really important and hits the nail on the head in a lot of ways. And actually, I would see that in a lot of ways as a defense mechanism against the problem of copying. I mean, the internet is the world's greatest copy machine, right? Copying existed well before the internet too. It's just the internet's incredible for it. And that's what we love about it. I mean, the fact that like we can transmit information so quickly, and you can reach distribution really fast through this copying. I mean, we love this, right? Copying just has its drawbacks too. And one of the ways you can avoid copying is you can become boy, this is a $10 word. It's the one that came to me, an obscurantist, I think is the word I was reaching for. Basically, like, it's going to be ironic that I went for that word though, because it basically, it means somebody who makes things too complex, right? As a way of enforcing this kind of like in-group, out-group thing. So, Eleanor Ostrom she's a Nobel Prize winning economist. She's brilliant. She's the late Eleanor Ostrom, but she was a huge inspiration for like the design and the way that we've thought about trying to solve these problems. And she had this, insight from observing all of these communities who've solved problems, around the world with like irrigation rights and like fishing access and stuff like that, like restocking fisheries. And one of her points, as she studied like these indigenous populations who had solved these supposed public goods problems, was that the public goods problems were actually coordination problems, and they could solve them without having somebody, right, necessarily put a fence around it. But one of the things, I say fence, right, because like there's no governmental fence with an army necessarily, but most of the time, and I actually think essentially all of the time in Ostrom's research, she finds that you have to restrict membership. Like you can't have it be permissionless, right? And so that's one of the fun and interesting and difficult design challenges you get in Web3, is that to do it in a permissionless way is interesting. And you might be able to do it, right, by making this stuff more legible and try to make the behavior like what we're trying to do with the split stream, where like you make the commitment evident to everybody else. And so maybe that can create this kind of like in-group, out-group kind of structure without necessarily permissioning or not permissioning somebody. But to get back to your point, speaking in a really complicated language that only some people can understand unnecessarily is a way of imposing a sort of boundary around your group, right? Like you automatically shrink the group to people who can understand you. And that's just an easier coordination problem to manage. So I think that's a huge problem. And I think it's a problem that is like emerging out of these fundamental core problems that we're trying to solve here, probably around attribution. That's my guess, my hope anyway. Yeah.
And so do you feel like when I think about modern academic institutions and kind of the career, is it like a career track or the path of the academic? How much of that, in terms of like the intention of the institutions, do you feel is about science and innovation and kind of humanity at large and moving us all forward? And I guess, making money and being profitable and continually feeding the system so that people come into it, people stay into it, people can't escape it, they can't survive without us kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, it's a hard one. And I mean, I can't give you a number because I don't know for sure, but like, there's definitely a lot of that. And I think it's hard because one of the things, this is just very personal experience. I wouldn't try to pretend to like speak for other scientific communities or disciplines, but, sometimes the people who were doing really valuable, important stuff were kind of like quiet and humble about it in a lot of ways, you know? And so they were sometimes the last people you would be able to say like, oh wow, that person's working on this kind of like crazy world changing stuff. They weren't able,
Hmm.
they would lack the skill set to be able to go give a grand speech of what they were doing. And you see that a lot, going back to like, actually, Bitcoin and the Web3 like infrastructure is actually a pretty good example of this. I mean, I don't know the personality characteristics of the people who worked on number theory, but number theory and math, which underlies a lot of modern cryptography, which of course is something we use all the time to build Web3, like number theory was long considered the most useless of, of mathematical disciplines. Like it was actually a point of pride for certain people, like that they were working on something so useless that they were truly pure in their motivations. Like I'm a pure mathematician because nobody could ever even try to apply this. And a
Oh,
lot of
that's
scientific
funny.
progress is like that. When you look at the history, it's like people are, well, you mentioned like the happenstance of two people meeting. The other
Hmm.
happenstance is like somebody works on a weird, abstruse problem, tinkering around trying to solve it, like number theory, just because they think it's interesting. And it turns out if somebody, does that enough and a group forms around it and pays enough attention, later on you can kind of shake this tree and out will pop some amazing technology that will then eventually become Web3, right? And that's such like a magical thing. At the same time, these are the last people in the world who could have sold you digital gold. I mean, they had no idea they were building it. Like their values were totally the opposite. So
Yeah, I think that gets back to what you were saying at the beginning with like the very distinct sets of skill sets that an idea needs to come into contact with to go from kind of a theory to a solution or an outcome in the world. That really makes me think kind of what you're talking about with the people that are just working away on something because they're working away on it. It's kind of this tension also between kind of the commercial viability of something and just the intellectual or creative pursuit of something. And I wonder with Web3 and say with science NFTs, if the intention is to all of those people like on the fringes where all of the really wild wacky stuff happens, I feel like Web3 is the best possible environment for those people to exist and kind of further what they're working on.
yeah,
I imagine that in like a traditional academic institution, that if you kind of aren't willing to play the game, then you will be sidelined. And so, whether that is in terms of publishing or going to awards or
yeah,
whatever internal politics. I'm sure there's plenty of politics internally on
oh yeah.
campus. And so I wonder if Web3 as an environment for these people on the fringes in particular to have a space to identify themselves, like you said, in terms of some sort of membership. So it's not completely open, but then also find a way to get funding, find other people to connect with. Is that like something that really excites you? I feel like I'm
Oh
really
yeah,
excited about the the potential of
absolutely.
that.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know if have you seen or can I tell you about the NFT that we sold? Yeah, so the science NFT that we sold was of a result from a crowd-funded study we conducted on this theory from a Berkeley psychologist named Seth Roberts. And Seth Roberts was kind of like a rat researcher who, taught some classes in statistics with some major statisticians and was a pretty serious thinker around stats. Came up with a
Mm-hmm.
theory that flavorless calories could curb your appetite. And this was based on like a couple of findings, but mainly just self like observation. And he did a lot of self experimentation and documented it, and it was pretty rigorous. He published papers on it, and it got favorably reviewed in the New York Times. Like Marginal Revolution liked it. Andrew Gelman, who I think co-taught with him, was like, "This is pretty interesting stuff." A lot of credible people were like friends with Seth and supported his research. Nassim Taleb's another example, who they were like, I don't know, most of these people were like, there's something to what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And Aaron Swartz, the co-founder of Reddit, tried the theory. It worked for him, and he was like, this is going to change the entire world. Like, people are led around by their appetite, right? Some people wish they could eat less, some people wish they could become a vegetarian and they're too tempted by bacon or whatever it is, right? And the idea that you could gain some control over your appetite in this simple way, which is just 200 calories of flavorless calories, um, would unlock so much. So he's like, as soon as the clinical trials come, the world's going to change. Can't wait, right? Just and it just never happens. So this 15 years go by and nobody has studied this thing. Now it's not my discipline at all. I'm a behavioral economist, but I'm in innovation, and I know, from the history that ideas like that and innovations like that can slip through the cracks, right? Because of this Aerovian
Right.
problem with sharing and commercialization, right? Like a flavorless calorie, hopelessly unpatentable. I mean, and he was like obsessed with actually making it as unpatentable as possible. Like he first tested it with extra light olive oil, but then he was like, "Could you hold your nose while you eat? Would that be a flavorless calorie?" Turns out, yes, at least as far as he found, right? So he was really trying to ensure you could never write a patent, intentionally or not. And it's also kind of, to be honest, like it's low status science, right?
Hmm.
Like he's a rat researcher doing self experimentation, like he's not able to stand on stage and show you the area of the brain that does, like he's not
Right.
integrating, which all that stuff's great. I mean, those are great scientists too. We're not knocking them, right? It's just sometimes these two things don't mesh well. And
Hmm.
the basic research just doesn't have a way of incorporating what seemed to be a pretty valid result. So no work was done on this thing that could literally, I mean, like save 2 million lives a year. Like that's how many people, or that's how many people die of obesity related causes, right? To say nothing of just like the social shame and the stigma and the vegetarianism. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things it could solve if it's true. Nobody tested it, right? So we
Yeah.
crowdfunded a test of it. The results look pretty good. I mean, they look about as good as you could expect, to be honest. And so we sold the result of that as an NFT, and that NFT is funding the replication. So I think so that will sort of prove out whether it really works or not. That I can get into the nerdy details about why I'm qualifying what our study was and why I say it looks pretty good, if you want.
Hmm.
But essentially, to your point, yes, I think it really happens a lot that because of the way science is structured and because of the way departments are and because of like what it takes to sort of like make the sausage of academia and teaching and research universities and so on, some things definitely slip through the cracks, and you can identify them on these dimensions, and maybe we can find ways to reward them.
That's really interesting. A couple of things. The idea of something isn't patentable, then it's kind of not worth. It's not that it's not worth proceeding, but like in terms of the commercial viability of the study. So there's this like in my head a group of knowledge that comes into stuff that is patentable, and then what you're talking about with flavorless calories almost feels something that should just be embedded into our layer of like base accessible knowledge in the world, which is, but again, because it's not commercially viable and everything needs to be commercially viable,
Yep.
then yeah, it just slips through the cracks. No one looks into it. We could be saving lives, but because it's not saving lives by administering medicine or pharmaceuticals or doing something that someone can make money from, it's the absence of something, or this idea that we talk about in Kernel a lot, which is negation, and
Mm.
it's yeah that's it's. I'm excited that you did that, and I'm really grateful that the kind of tools and mechanisms that you're able to use with Web3 allowed for that. And also, I guess just this idea of this thing of ideas slipping through the cracks because they aren't, yeah, they don't have the requisite status or
Yeah.
financial outcome. What does that body of knowledge look like? Like, how big is that?
I mean, it's really hard to know. Like, I would go back to the public goods framing of it when we talk about patentability, right? Because public goods are things that are non-excludable. And what a patent
Hmm.
gives you is excludability in theory, right? You
Hmm.
get to say, nobody's allowed to take this and not give me any credit, or else the government will come and take you to court or whatever, right? If you fall out of that excludability, then you're back in the realm of pure public goods. Or, I mean, that's one dimension anyway. So how big is the knowledge? I mean, my guess is it's huge. I mean, you can never know for sure, but if there's one thing economists think, it's that people respond to incentives, right? Like there's one lesson, there's one like foundational thing of economics. People respond to incentives, right? And if there's one lesson of the economics of innovation, it's the incentives are terrible. So, so the idea that like the if we think people respond to incentives and we think the incentives are terrible, we think we're probably way, way worse than we could be if we were able to improve the incentives somewhat. But the fundamental problem, and actually I can reference like so Vitalik has a piece on entrepreneurial public goods, he calls it, which is effectively the same thing as the Einstein example that I mentioned earlier. So entrepreneurial public goods are the sorts of things that are just very hard to, that's what he calls things that are very hard to identify before they're done, right? Before they're completed, right? So sharing the theory of relativity, it's very hard to figure out why that's so good. I didn't have that term when I wrote my essay, by the way. I would have included it. I think he came up with like a month later or something for the quadratic funding paper, which is of course amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this class of, I guess what you can call entrepreneurial public goods, or at least like public goods that are very hard to identify up front, like what the impact's going to be. I suspect they're enormous, right? I mean, they're probably sitting in people's notebooks that never get shared, or they're probably, or probably worse than that, to be honest. Probably they're sitting in things you could have developed off of those notebooks if you thought there was any hope, right? That you could share it openly or cooperate or get somebody, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. So what do you think is with those ideas that don't come to life? Oh, wait, stop. Sorry. First, I just want to go back to what you said, because I just had a visual pop into my mind when you were talking, which is this idea that at the moment, the way that scientific research happens and kind of the people that take part in that process, it almost feels like a little bit circular, in the sense that, like, say we're like on a map and we're trying to discover like the outermost frontier that hasn't been discovered before. But everyone's kind of going in a circle to that place instead of just like going straight to the edge of the map. And so that's one thing. And I wonder, in terms of accessing that knowledge and kind of what we're talking about, this idea of entrepreneurial public goods, do you think that it's an issue of gatekeeping or an issue of funding, in terms of having a space to allow for that to kind of come into the world?
I mean, I think it's a matter of credit on some level. Like it might be as simple as attribution, but it scales up to the level of funding too, right? At some point, like people want a reward for sharing. Some people, I mean, you can also get a sort of like good feeling out of sharing these things in general. But if it's something that has a huge fixed cost, if you spend years and years on it, or you'd have to spend years and years on it or whatever, it's hard to just kind of like give it away and see that it turns into whatever else it is, presumably. I mean, this is the incentives matter story, yeah? So the model in my head, I mean, might as well tell you, like, there's a behavioral economics structure called the trust game. And I actually played this live for the OG NFT conference a couple months ago. But the trust game is like, I have $10 and I can either take this $10, and we play this literally like in a lab with real money in economics experiments.
Okay.
I have $10. I can either take the $10 and just leave the lab and say, there's my 10. And you are like my counterparty here, and you get nothing if I do that. Or I can send you the 10. And when I send you the 10, it gets like magically multiplied into 30, right? And so that's the magic of division of labor. That's kind of what we're talking about before, like marrying up the like Einstein with the person who can actually run a GPS company or something, right? Like that's how kind of like fundamental wealth or productivity is created. So that's what that $30 represents to me, right? If I share, you can take something that I did and make something amazing with it, right? But because knowledge, or some of these aspects of knowledge, are totally non-excludable, right? Because I can't enforce a patent against you, or because you could always say, "Oh, interesting. Funny fact. I was actually thinking about the exact same thing like a couple of minutes ago. Cool. But great to hear your perspective. Like you can always do that in the real world. Like there's no way to like look inside somebody's neurons or whatever and figure out if they're being honest. So that means when you get the 30 in this this experiment, which by the way we don't explain the innovation part of it. It's really just about money in the lab. You can either give me some back if you want, or you can just keep the whole 30. And so the experiment becomes, well, do I ever give 10? And if I do give money, right, like, does it get returned to me? Because then the problem becomes backwards, right? Like, now you have this $30 that got multiplied, and you can just leave the lab. I mean, I'll never know who you are, right? And
Hmm.
so you're really just kind of donating to charity at this point in some way, right? Like, you can just give 30, you can give some portion, or you cannot. And anyway, when you play this in a lab, you find that trusting people, like people who give some portion of the 10, including the whole 10 or whatever it is, like, they get pretty much that amount back exactly. And that's about it. But that's great. I mean, I think that's totally sufficient in the real world. It's really just, I really think like sufficiency is probably all you need, some amount that sort of like pays people back for the risk. But
Yeah.
so anyway, that's kind of the idea, that commitment that smart contract enabled signals the participation in the system, which can ultimately flow value back to this kind of like basic research. And I mean, I'm not saying it's like an easy problem, but that's kind of like what we've built up for the last 2 years. And when I say we, I like came out of work with me and block science founder Michael Zarg, and we kind of hacked on some of the mechanisms around this.
Oh, cool. So when you say signaling, like signals, and that smart contracts enable signals,
Yeah.
my I get really excited because I love talking about signaling.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay, I
But
thought you were gonna say,
I,
what do you mean? I was like,
I,
oh no.
oh no, but I was actually just talking to someone about this, which is this idea that, in the real world, a signal, instead of, and I don't know if I read this in one of your papers as well, that we don't, you don't take a snapshot of your bank account. You'll like go to a shopping mall and buy something from Gucci and then like walk around the mall for the whole day with your Gucci bag. And you're like, yes, I can afford something from Gucci or whatever. And but it's really interesting with blockchain and wallets. And I am so excited to see how people innovate here.
Yeah.
And then also to think about how signaling can be used in like almost in a really pure and noble way in terms of people's participation in these kind of games, which are, I guess, like very humanitarian as opposed to very consumer based.
Yeah.
And thinking about, so what sort of solutions in terms of using the mechanism and thinking about incentives and signaling to make sure that the person with the $30 doesn't just leave, or what sort of stuff have you thought about in terms of signals and wallets and smart contracts?
Yeah, I mean, like, Plank is in some ways a fairly simple design. We have, I think, probably seven. It's a combination of seven mechanisms. The two we used for the original split stream, we have these conventions. That's like the technical game theory term. You call them norms. You call them like suggestions, whatever they are. That you only share with things that also cite, and you only share or you favor sharing with things that cite, and you favor sharing with things that share openly. Um, and what you get out of that is, right, I talked about the sort of smart contracts commitment that you get out of this kind of like split stream sharing mechanism, right? Well, that first rule is about kind of plugging into that, right? So that those people are at least referring some amount of value, whether it's split stream value or at least like attention value, to somewhere else. And then the second one about sharing openly, that gets you like some intelligibility around like what you share back to. And actually, this will probably get us too much in the weeds about the Planck design. But the fundamental two things are, you have NFTs, which give you this connection to the future, right? In an individual connection to the future, such that one person could see like the sets appetite theory research. And even if everybody else kind of thought it was a little crazy, it's like, oh, this is actually interesting. And that person, who I call like an idea entrepreneur, can kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to buy that, and I'm going to try to like see what can be done with it, and I'm going to push it, and I'm going to meme it, and I'm also maybe going to enforce attribution, right? Because the nature of purchasing this NFT already encodes the attribution to the person's original idea, right? So that gives you a little bit of this division of labor. And then, right, the person who has the NFT, like the person who owns our early NFT, let's say this study does come out in the summer and could totally falsify this research, but it could find, wow, this is like this incredible unlock for major human problems. I mean, I would have to expect, or I would like to expect, that the value of that NFT, even like as a personal, like sentimental memorial like thing to have, the coolness factor of it should go up. I mean, the person the person helped fund the research that did this amazing stuff, right? Um, so that's piece one. And piece two is the split stream commitment that you can get when you have, yeah, like when you're able to say, here are the people I consider relevant and important to the research I'm doing, right? And right, like that gives you the commitment, and also because those are all going to be things that are shared openly, you can kind of look at them in theory and at least figure out whether that makes any sense. Like, okay, are you split streaming to just like your cousin and your uncle and everybody? You know what I mean? Like, which is sort of a natural problem. I mean, honesty is the fundamental thing here, right? And it's trivial to be like, okay, well, the people who really helped me here do this Nobel Prize winning research were, you know, my wife and my sister and my lawyer, who is, you know, those are the three. So you just get all the money. It would be sort of the idea. And to avoid that, right, you kind of have to be like, well, what did your lawyer do? And what your lawyer did should be shared openly so we can sort of see it and see if it actually makes sense that you're citing them. And so with those two things, like as the effective building blocks, like that's how we think we can make a little progress on it.
Yeah. Wow. I'm okay. I'm just like struck by DAO fever at the moment, and so
Mm,
I just think I can this one alternate reality that I'm thinking of. I can like imagine a DAO that full of like these idea entrepreneurs, like you said, who fund science NFTs on Plank from people who are on the fringes and maybe just yeah don't fit in anywhere else, or do, but you know are kind of opting into this because it's almost like research up until now. I know there's like no hard point in time, but it feels like there's an opportunity by moving some of this work to take place openly on the blockchain and for there to be a record forever of it. It's almost like closing a huge chapter of science in a way, and just in terms of how it's recorded, and
mm.
starting a new chapter that where those problems maybe they just stop. The attribution problem just stops, doesn't persist, and because we have these new tools and mechanisms to build up this knowledge base. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I mean, I don't. I agree with you. I hope, and I very much hope that there will be a DAO like that that will try to collect like science NFTs that have a lot of promise, and try to hold them in hope. You know, especially if that stuff is going to fund replications or validations of the research or whatever it's going to be. I think that would be a really cool thing. Yeah, and in terms of the attribution problem, I mean, I think it's thorny enough that saying it will be. You know, I would say
that's
we
true.
can hopefully make steps in the direction of solving it, but we really are working with this like tricky parameter of like your what the source of your knowledge, the source of what you know and what in your new ideas exists in your head. At the end of the day, like the attribution is always going to come down to your willingness to reveal and be honest about what inspired you, right? Because of
Yeah.
the problems we've mentioned before. You can always say, "Oh, I was already thinking of that idea 5 minutes before," or like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or like it's easy to do that because well, I don't know, like it's just very easy. Like nobody can tell you otherwise, right? Nobody knows what you're thinking or not. And this is a point that Paul Romer makes. He's an economist, a Nobel Prize winning economist who his phrase is like your ideas are always perfectly secure in your neurons, right? It's codified ideas that are not safe, right? That are non-excludable, and that's the thing that needs to be shared, and that's what Planck's sort of built on. But at the same time, right, the interplay between what is like nobody can tap into, right, which you know what you were inspired by or whatever. Maybe you don't actually. I mean, sometimes you don't, but that's
Mm.
totally unsolvable, right? It's
Yeah.
just, I mean, if you don't even know what you're inspired by, like, good luck to you, right? But you know, sometimes we do. We'll be like, oh, that triggered something, right? Like something
Mm-hmm.
you read, or
Yeah.
I'm going to base off this. And if you can be honest about it, I mean, and make it okay to be honest about, which I think is a really important, like, normative thing that we can do. Like, really make it so that idea theft is not theft. You know what I mean? Like, if you share an NFT and you sell your NFT of your thing, and somebody takes it, God bless them. Like you know that you can be like, I would love to sell to the better CEO. Like I hate the idea that like if you or you know, I'm sure most people who don't fancy themselves the world's best CEO, which I certainly wouldn't, right? Are like, well, gosh, any good thing I come up with, like there's probably a better executive who could pull it off, you know? Right. It's just a matter of like they don't have this little piece that maybe I developed, or I mean maybe they do, right? Like that's the whole problem. But creating that division of labor and making it okay for that division of labor to happen, I think is really powerful. You know?
That was really exciting for me. When you were talking about idea theft, it just made me think of, with DeFi, where you talk about money Legos and we
Yeah.
say everything is composable. And so you can just like take a Uniswap contract and, build something onto it or change it or whatever it is. And then just like changing people's frame of mind around ideas and this idea that they can be composable and that, yeah, it's not theft to like take something from one place and to build on it, or as long, hopefully with the intention of keeping people honest and
Yeah.
acknowledging attribution, but just this again, I just think of all of how much that broadens the scope for knowledge, as opposed to this idea that like knowledge is very contained, like there is almost like only one in and out, and that is through like a published academic journal, and that's it. So yeah, just like this idea Legos, I kind of like that.
Yeah, no, I like it too. I like it too, and I think it's really important to develop good norms around idea Legos that recognize how important it is for people who execute on ideas. I mean, right now there's a sense in which like people who execute on ideas, um, they're kind of rewarded in the marketplace because they're the ones who
Mhm.
are often able to capture value, right? Like once an idea is shared, if it's a good, profitable idea, it's now just a race between who can execute on it better, right? And of course, you're going to have to solve like little ideas along the pathway too. So I'm not saying it's not like an innovative process, but if it's a matter of like who can execute better on this idea of, X times Y equals a constant or what, right? Like in a market maker or whatever it is, right? Like it's often going to be like who's the most technical and like who's the best manager, and all these things are super important. And I think weirdly, we have this crazy like status imbalance that's rooted in the fact that because we're so terrible at rewarding ideas, like financially, there's no way to like impose financial rewards on people. We try to give people who innovate a lot of status, right? Because that's like the one thing
That's interesting.
yeah, that's like the one thing you can do is you can be like, okay, well, they're the inventor. Well, that's cool and that's really helpful, right? And it's like a way of like giving them something free that's at least a recognition, but
Mm.
also it makes the people who execute want to claim the status, right? Because it's like, well, okay, do I just look like some bum who just made $1 million stealing some guy's idea, and he's the
Right.
grand innovator? But it's like it shouldn't be like that, right? The execution matters too, of course, right? And I think we should have more status for the executors. I think innovator status should go down and money should go up by
Well,
some
I
amount.
just imagine I just imagine this. I don't know how to imagine mathematical things, but I just imagine like status on one side and like financial, like monetary outcome on the other side. And it's kind of like the person who has that first initial idea and the person that takes it to market. And it's almost like status needs to go this way to meet this person, and money needs to flow this way to meet this person. And then
Yeah,
that would really change things.
I think it would. I think it would. I think what people are pushing on there is we have this inherent like status idea around the innovator
Mm.
that's there for a reason. Because like right, I'm sure those people are doing fine. I don't know what happened to them, right? But there's the sense that we have to have these outside status rewards for innovators, right? And that the person who executes on it is just doing this simple thing, and that they get compensated by the massive amounts of money. And I think the balance around that, right? Like it's a problem because it incentivizes the people who have, let's say, market power and have a huge company and a huge like platform to just claim they're innovators too, right? And it's like you shouldn't do that if you didn't come up with the basic idea. Like you should have the space to be willing to attribute, and it'd be okay for you to attribute, right? Without it suddenly seeming like, okay, well, you just ripped this person off and now you're going to be insulted by everybody for doing it, like you're adding no value. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. I feel
Okay.
like there is now such a real risk that the person that takes the idea to market gets both status and kind of the financial payoff. And then the
Yeah.
person who created the idea, who, was rolling around with this thing in their head for years, and then it took them years to, really flesh it out and, codify it. And then
I totally
they
agree.
get left with potentially nothing. If they don't get attribution, they don't even get the status. They definitely don't get the financial payoff like bringing the idea to market does. So this feels like a really big problem that can I think just fundamentally change knowledge, which I've realized is a common thread that seems to come up a lot in Web3, which is just this idea, last episode I was talking to Mike Elias from Idea Market, and just this idea that
great.
the knowledge that we deem to be common knowledge, it seems it's so narrow in scope, and we don't really do any risk management on the knowledge that we have. And there are some things in my life where I do try to look up scientific journals and that have been papers that have been written. And obviously I come up against paywalls and things like that. So do you think that science NFTs can maybe change the friction, like the point of friction, which in terms of funding this research and innovation, so that the friction is like at the beginning with getting funding and not when it comes to like accessing or distributing the information?
I mean, that's obviously one of the great dreams of NFTs and what the promise of NFTs, right? Is this was eloquently expressed by Chris Dixon in 1,000 True Fans, and Jesse Walden has been really eloquent about it as well. I think in the early paper I wrote something like Darwin's idea, or like people pay $100,000 for a page of Darwin's Origin of the Species, not because it's obscure, but because it's so widely shared, right? So it's a sort of similar idea that the property. This is a little bit rough. Like if there's any like economists watching this, I apologize that I'm going to be a little loose with my terminology here. But the rough idea is it's anti-rivalry. Like that's an element of a public good as well. That something is rival in use, right? Like if I take a bite out of a sandwich, you can't take that same bite out of the sandwich. It's gone, right? It's not the sandwich anymore, right? That's some notion of rivalry in use. And Eleanor Ostrom calls it subtractability. I always want to reference her because she's brilliant. But if NFTs aren't subtractable, right? If we can finally get rid of this pesky, why don't I just use the JPEG? It's the same thing argument, right? Which hopefully we can. Hopefully NFTs will have sufficient hedonic value that it will feel truly like you've got something different, even if other people kind of can't tell the difference. In the same way that like a scarf can be the scarf your grandmother knitted for you instead of any other scarf, even if it's only you who knows or cares about that, and most people don't, right? Like if we can do that, then I think we can get this nice property of anti-rivalry where it's like, well, the status of this NFT, the science NFT, let's say, Seth's appetite theory, should be enhanced by how widely known the study and the study results are, right? And so you really get this like beautiful early dream of the open internet where like we're going to freely share everything and it's going to be great, but also finally align it with the incentive compatibility of like, well, why should I share if nobody's going to attribute anything to me, right? Like now you have to kind of be tricked by companies of sort of like sharing your data or sharing your ideas because you get a little status or like a little like, like hit or whatever it is on Twitter or some equivalent, right? If you're able to enhance those incentives, we think maybe some really, really good things could happen. And hopefully like NFTs along with some of these other mechanisms could really be a nice way to do it.
That's really awesome. I am going to look at NFTs basically just as incentive machines now in my mind, thanks to to kind of like the economic lens that you've exposed me to. And I'm so excited because, and obviously you must feel something similar to this, which is the mechanism of NFTs have so much potential, obviously beyond, say, that digital art file or hash that people now associate it with, but coming at it from the science NFT angle is really exciting. I'm so excited to follow Plank and see what you do. And I really enjoy talking to you. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you so much. This was great. I really appreciate you having me on.